So brief introduction. You probably all know Xin Wei. He is one of the, in a place like ASU, which sort of has a lot of interdisciplinary thinkers. Xin Wei certainly is in the top percentile of those, trained as a mathematician, but then longtime director of the schools of arts, media, and engineering, and now already in the School of Complex Adaptive Systems. He also sort of heads the Synthesis Lab, which is a very innovative entity that he will tell us more about and where this is going, which is also attached to the Global Futures Laboratory. So Xin Wei, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Manfred. It's a pleasure to be with you, you all. So I know the talk promised in this order, infrastructure clinics and navigating uncertainty, but I wanted to take the opportunity, since I'm speaking to colleagues and peers here, to lay out some of the, here we go. Let me just make sure I can do this while I play within, there we go. Okay, let's try. I want to make sure that I can actually show these slides.
You should be able to.
Yeah, I'm going to try again. Okay, let's go back. And then I go back to make sure you can see the slides now. Good. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to, since I'm speaking to, in a sense, it's an in-house talk, I wanted to spend a bit more time linking this conversation with past presentations by Manfred, in fact, with the inaugural Making Sense of Complexity last year, and also most recently Sandra's talk and Sarah's talk. You'll see it at various points of tangency. So this will be a little bit more theoretical than what the abstract promised. And I hope that's okay, because we're here in our home territory. But I wanted to spend about three of the sections on some problems that maybe are methodological problems, and then take the last 7 sections pointing out constructively, well, what can we do despite those fundamental limits on computational approaches to complexity. All right. So basically, starting first of all with what some people call object-oriented ontology, thinking about the world in terms of objects, and in line with that's what Sandra was talking about, and other people were talking about, how do we move from an object-oriented ontology toward more process-oriented ways of looking at things. So one of the comments is that there's this Pythagorean snare, what some people call Pythagorean snare, that bedevils some of the theories that we have inherited, I think, where what that means is mistaking the accidents of history, the accidents of how computers were engineered and designed, the accidents of the evolution of IT, for something more fundamental, something like a metaphysical necessity. So 3 examples that come to mind are the example of the telegraph, which I'll come back to later on, and the well-known example where Shannon himself pointed to the telegraph as a model for his theory of mathematical communication. Another example is a model of the CPU and memory and registers, a kind of basic computer engineering architecture, which then you can see hints of in some models of human cognition and psychology. I'm going very briefly here, okay, just to hit a few highlights here. And a third is inheriting from naive set theory, this idea that sets can be defined unambiguously without contradiction in terms of membership determined by some sort of predicate function. X is a member of set T if if X has some finite set of predicates, okay, and that this is enough for building up some sort of ontology. And it's what we know now, of course, since Gödel, that this is not this doesn't avoid contradictions, okay. And yet we see a lot of this kind of object-oriented ontology being repeated in some of the more conceptual philosophical current work. Okay. Um, so there are many alternatives. Okay, just to point out two alternatives. One is when we move from an object-oriented ontology to a relational. Uh, and this is, of course, these are all old moves, okay, but I just want to bring them out to foreground them a little bit more. So thinking in terms of configurations of theories or accounts where the relations among entities are first-class entities in the theory. And from there, we can also make a further move toward an accounts where we have fields, continuous fields. And this is well known from physics, right? The old physics duality between waves and particles. But it's interesting to see that despite that well-known duality, right, a lot of the engineering is still resorting to more let's say, traditional metaphysics of object-based ontologies. A second move is moving from objects to transformations, and we've said this several times already in our discussions as a school. Sandra referred to it as well. So this is not a new move to make. I just want to add that for mathematics, we do have access to some theories, such as topological dynamical systems, that are fairly robust. Okay, and I'll say more about what I mean by robust. Now, problems with categorization. These are, again, pretty well known. If you, for example, look at set theory and notions of set membership, Wittgenstein himself in Philosophical Investigations famously talked about family resemblance, right? So a member of a family. What is a member of a family or a clan? Any two members might have some feature in common, but there's no feature that can be used as a predicate that defines membership in the family, right? Another is what I call the Frankenstein problem, where you have a living system like a body, right? You decompose it into various components, like how many you pile up all the carbon atoms or pile up all the oxygen atoms. You have these little neat piles, which are atom for atom, identical to the atoms where I had my body, but they don't make a living body. Okay, this is just a cartoon of the Frankenstein problem. Related to that problem is on the theory side, the modularity thesis, that to understand a system, you can decompose it into subsystems, and understand subsystems, you can recompose a theory for the whole. Of course, this is very familiar to us. This modularity thesis is well understood to be false in most conditions, in most cases for real use, right? But it happens to be used over and over again, especially in engineering systems. A fourth one is this media mode specificity of technology. Like in software where we have drawing applications, we have spreadsheets, and we have word processors, et cetera, et cetera. So they're all mode specific, okay? And in fact, media specific. But this pen, right, I can use this to make a figure, to make mathematical calculation. I can write a letter. I can draw a picture, okay? So it seems obvious, but it's not easy to undo that kind of specificity, which is another kind of a lock-in issue, but a very fundamental lock-in issue. And finally, a section on problems with data and information. This might be a bit more polemical now. So along the way, I'm really moving toward trying to respond to some of the Sandra's challenges for new science that is not reductive. Or the question is, can there be a science that is not reductive? If we think that data is the way out, well, there are certain issues with that I'd like to raise. Okay, one of them is just kind of under a large umbrella saying that data are inherently reductive. Okay, and the more we do work on constructing the data, the more doors that are closed, in a sense, to features of experience that are not made legible by the data as much as other features that are made legible. Okay, so a very strong example is distinguishing between the wet neurochemistry and what's called neural networks. Okay, so this is kind of obvious. We should look directly head on to the kind of models that are built accounting for wet neurochemistry in nervous tissue on one side, and then looking at the drastic and radical reductions that are made when we go to engineering models of some processes that are labeled learning, for example. Okay, and this is kind of obvious, of course, but you might say, well, that's just how do you say, a marketing term for algorithms, but the marketing terms tend to have a lot of capital weight. I can't see people's hands so easily, so maybe Michael or Manfred can tell me if there's some urgent question that should be addressed, okay, along the way. But I'll just keep rolling, if that's okay.
I'll let you know, Xin Wei.
Okay, I can also unmute yourself if you want. It's fine. Now, with respect to information or digital models of communication, if we look carefully at the second paragraph of the founding article, where Claude Shannon defines information bit and entropy, or bit, entropy, and information. If you look at the second paragraph, he was a good mathematician and he was a very good scientist. So he knew right at the outset what would be included inside his theory and would not be included inside his theory. And he stated right there in yellow, in bold, that what is usually considered to be part of communication is what we call meaning. And he gave a kind of a back of the envelope definition of meaning for his purposes. And then he says, for the purposes of the engineering problem, that aspect of meaning is irrelevant. Okay. Now, we should keep this firmly in mind when we come to think about later on. We think about value-laden systems, or think about trying to model questions of preference or what have you, or ethics, etc. Okay, but the question is, if that is already excluded from representation from the get-go, when we try to claim that digital systems are somehow harboring information, it's coming from somewhere, but not from the way the digital information systems are set up or defined, okay, formally. Okay. Another is this model, as we know, of the Shannon model communication, which is modeled from the telegraph, which explicitly says this in the paper, right? That we have the sender, a receiver, a channel, and these are all discrete and known ahead of time, okay, and et cetera, and away we go. Different kinds of encoding. But if you think in terms of radio, or even think in terms of something like contact improvisation, communication is happening all the time, and meaningful communication is happening all the time, by which I mean something more like a Heideggerian notion of language, or languaging, rather, communicating, ing, progressive tense, in the sense of orienting collective attention and coordinating joint action. So I'm thinking of languaging as characterized by those two powers. One is to coordinate joint attention, the other is to coordinate joint action. Okay. So if you think of languaging this way, it really allows us to think much more amply in terms of what language and meaning are doing, okay, in such a sense. And we already see more clearly what are the inadequacies of this kind of digital or informatic approaches to language. Then this other section is another point, is this point that Sander raised, that the signal noise distinction is contingent. Okay, and but just to drive it home again, just want to say very succinctly that this distinction between signal and noise is a decision. Okay, it's a theoretical decision and an engineering decision, as every logical engineer knows. Okay, so these decisions are very complex decisions, and as we know from history of science, these complex decisions themselves, being theory-related, and also socially infused, not determined, but infused. Okay, all sorts of ways. And one of the fundamental problems with data science, let's say marketing, let's put it this way, is the maybe the unintended implication that data is nature. That is, we start from the data as if data came to us God-given, just landed in me. And I don't have to ask so much about how it was constructed and what were the theories that allowed it to be, instruments to be made that decided that this is data, or this is signal, meaningful signal, and this rest is noise. Okay. So, but instead, if we quote start with data, we're making this kind of metaphysical assumption that data is the ground. Okay. Now, next section, problems with algorithmic pattern matching. As we know from basic logic, or again, this is coming from before, Manfred mentioned in the inaugural talk in passing Aristotle, right, and also the famous classical analyses of cause. And there are different kinds of causes, of course, but certainly correlation is not all. Okay, in other words, it's very easy to find examples where correlation is not the same thing as causation. There are all sorts of causation, okay? And also that correlation is not the same thing as logical inference. When I put it so baldly, it seems pretty obvious. But when we get into the thick of things, for example, in the presence of big data and data mining and machine learning and pattern recognition, that tends to drop away. So we need to keep clearly in mind that these are not at all the same. Of course, this has grave consequences in medical research. For example, we know this. Another, which is more perhaps surprising because maybe less well known, is that more data is less knowledge. Put more formally, it's a theorem by a friend and colleague, or senior colleague, I should say, Giuseppe Longo and Christian Colude in 2016, a paper titled The Deluge of Spurious Correlations in Big Data. It's a mathematical paper with proof in Ramsey theory. The theorem is that, and I'll paraphrase, okay. Think of, let's say, you're trying to build an ontology for a database, not a philosophical ontology, but a database ontology, okay? Have a bunch of entities, then they have predicates, some finite set of predicates, what color shirt I'm wearing, how much is my cat going to weigh tomorrow, Lady Gaga's hair color next week, whatever, okay? A bunch of predicates and entities, and define a correlation, okay? Now, given that correlation, okay, of some features that you fix, there is the number, an integer, such that any database with more than that integer called k, more than k elements, will exhibit that correlation. With these entities, will exhibit that correlation. Okay, this is very strong. This does not depend on how the correlation was established. Does not depend on how you collect the data or whatever. It's only dependent on the cardinality size of the database. So this, when I heard about it, I was really surprised. Okay, so you think about this. That means that you have, another way to phrase it is that you have sufficiently large databases. They will exhibit arbitrary correlations. You can make up arbitrary correlation, and not just one. It's not about exhibiting one database. It's every single database that's bigger than that threshold size will exhibit that invented correlation. This is an extremely strong theorem. It's proven by Ramsey theory. Okay. And as I asked Giuseppe about this, and said, well, is that k a very large number? I said, well, it is a large number, but we already have databases that are on that order of magnitude when we're looking at medical research. So the grave ethical problems that can be coming up already, for example, in cancer research. I'll skip the details here, okay? Another category of theorems now, is in machine learning what's called no free lunch theorems. And I wish I could see people's faces in this talk. My screen is too small. And this may be a bit more well-known among the experts, but I thought it was very funny, just collecting together. These are a lot of papers by this fellow David Wolpert, but it's a large set of work. And again, Sander mentioned Hume. Sander and Gary in their paper mentioned Hume, thinking about this question of patterns. Okay. Basically, the question in machine learning is: can you construct an algorithm? Is there kind of a bias-free, learning algorithm that will be adept at learning any kind of pattern? Okay. And the answer is negative. That is, if you have some algorithm that's good at detecting certain kinds of features, all right, and pulling those objects with those features out from your set, it will be poor. It will do poorly at some other set of features. Okay, and it would be no better than there's no one algorithm that will stand out as being really kind of much better than everything else, despite what Google says. All right. So this is also a very, very strong theorem. It puts a strong limit on what machine learning can claim to do. And the fundamental thing is at the bottom of that page. How well the algorithm does depends on how aligned the learning algorithm between the training set of your learning algorithm and the posterior data that's thrown at it. Okay? So if you throw data at this algorithm that it was not trained on, likely it's not going to do very well. Very strong theorem. These are theorems, okay? Of course, I'm trained in mathematics. I actually like finding these kinds of, theorems that are robust against data. Okay. Now let's try to. I'm going to turn for the rest of this toward now more, constructive, positive. Okay, so there's life after all this. Okay. And let me pause for a minute to see if there's some questions. See if there's some questions.
I don't see anything in the chat or a hand yet, Shimon.
All right, let me go forward. Now, starting point, besides process and processuality, would be experience. Okay, by experience, I'm thinking about American pragmatists, William James, famously William James, John Dewey, and C.S. Peirce. Okay, but then of course, in terms of genealogies, also Alfred North Whitehead and most famously Gilles Deleuze, who studied the American pragmatists very, very intently. Okay. So I want we to make, I'll just try to be very compact here, okay? Think if we start with experience, we don't say yet whose experience or what's experience. Okay, experience of what, okay? But experience, and this William James writes very clearly about what could be meant by that, okay? So I'm not going to go through all that. But maybe a compact way of saying that is Martin Jay's phrase, experience without a subject, without an a priori subject, okay? Another quality of this kind of approach is thinking about relations as being prior to relata, the terms of the relation, rather than thinking of relations as secondary to relata. Maybe a better way to put that is to think about how relations and relata co-construct each other. And finally, this ontological principle that Alfred North Whitehead posed, okay, but also William James, that we admit into our accounts only that which is found in experience. The experience doesn't have to be just, like matter experience. It could be what we think of as conceptual experiences too, right? Emotional experiences too, okay? But anyway, admit only that which is found in experience and do not start with idealist conceits, such as what? Well, such as subject, mind, consciousness, bit, information, data. These are highly constructed, okay, idealist notions. So if we don't start with things like that, what do we have? Sensemaking, okay, another set of notions. Sensemaking, the making of sense. Here in the kind of processualist spirit, we would be moving from the way I talk to my students, talk about this with my students, move from thinking about the world in terms of nouns and adjectives to thinking about everything that we experience in terms of verbs and adverbs, the manner in which things are happening or transforming. It's just a way of thinking, okay, that loosens up certain things. This will link forward to another talk about, a full-on talk about this idea of infrastructure clinics as a service, okay? So another move is to move from the very, dear analytic habit of classifying, recognizing phenomena, right, toward enacting or making sense of a shared situation, okay? This is why I spent 20 years working with people coming from, even though I'm trained in mathematics and philosophy, I spent 20 years looking carefully at what performing artists do, how dancers, how performing musicians, how people in athletics or martial arts make sense of a shared situation, okay, and to enact certain actions. For example, can you hear something if I did that? So this is live. These are all gestural real-time responsive media. Okay, meaning these dancers are wearing sensors on them, and as they're moving, they're inventing on the fly new gestures, new coordinated action that are meaningful to them on the spot. Okay, nobody told them ahead of time exactly how to move, but we gave them these technologies so that they can, in a sense, they're aware music producing organs in a sense, okay? Um, but we're interested in among other things, in this kind of tacit knowledge. This is Michael Polanyi's famous characterization. We know more than we can tell. Okay, in his book, The Tacit Dimension, or Satender Gill's work more recently from Tacit Engagement, thinking about these different kinds of knowledges, right? Not just know that, which is typical for scientific knowledge, but also know how, kind of acting, operating kind of knowledge, know why, judgment, know when, action, performance. Okay? In order to make sense of sense making, we would have to go much more deeply into thinking about what sense might mean. And I don't have time today to think about this with you. In fact, this is an open project, okay? But I do want to just cite a few people. Most importantly, Gilles Deleuze himself, in The Logic of Sense. There's a very nice paper by Daniela Valls, an essay, where she unpacks some of Deleuze's notion of sense in terms of, reading against the Stoics and also Nietzsche, okay? And then very recently, an amazing book by David Morris, a friend and philosopher in Montreal, on Merleau-Ponty and what he calls developmental ontology. Again, I won't spend time today on this, but I do want to point out that sense, people talk about sense making all the time, right? But this requires a careful understanding. Okay. Now, you've already seen me referring to working with people who make sense, who can articulate, coordinate action, communicate, right? Coordinated attention action through movement, all right? So this is part of a response to a very large body of work, right? It's well known, 4E cognition, right? Embodied, embedded, extended, and active work. But I do want to emphasize the work that we are doing now is to not think in terms of 4E cognition, because to me that seems like a reverse construction, trying to rehabilitate cognition, which is already has certain idealist tendencies embedded in it from the get-go. But think in terms of 4E experience, okay? With this kind of presumption that, this kind of embodied, bodied corporeal engagement with the ambient, I had to be careful about vocabulary here, okay? Because ambient already assumes the distinction between self and world, which is not so, it's not determined a priori before the event, okay? But in any case, that having a body makes a big difference, which is very obvious maybe, but also not so obvious in the age of virtual reality, okay? But there are very, very careful thinkers in this domain, such as Maxine Sheets Johnston, perhaps the most important philosopher who's been trained in movement studies and movement arts, and of course the great director Jerzy Grotowski. Okay, what Stuart Kaufman asked about the hammer, okay, we can transpose to questions about the gesture. Meaning, he said, I give you a hammer, tell me all the things it can do. And then he pauses and he laughs and asks you, do you feel your mind going blank? Right? And it goes on with that little bit of a thought experiment. Same thing can be applied to movement and gesture. Okay? What's the implication from that? That is, just as with a hammer, its use is not a set, actually. It's not determinate, it's indeterminate. The same can be said for any kind of movement or gesture. That is, they have, you might say, infinite information content, because the more you think about it, the more we interrogate the situation, the more can be articulated. So they have infinite, or let's say unbounded, information content. Okay. Next point, scale. We typically have this issue, right? We talk about scale with complex adaptive systems. We start from the get-go with systems, right? So it gives us a lot of purchase. But one of the things I'd like to ask is, maybe there's all sorts of ways to think about scale issues or aggregation issues that maybe we could visit, especially in the age when data itself is so unwieldy and carries grave methodological problems. Okay, so what are some ways to move from the individual to the system, to thinking systemically from mathematics? Okay, I'm not claiming these are going to work out. I'm just saying that there are these other ways of thinking, okay, that are not, okay, I'll just say it, okay. One is, the first one that comes to mind is regional. If you think of an integral over a region, that gives you a local but not point-wise measure of the function, as was done in quantum mechanics and distribution theory, right? The direct delta function is defined this way, okay? So that's an obvious one. Thinking in terms of flux across the surface, these are all sorts of ways to think about regionally, okay? And the region can be the entire manifold, or can be, limited down. Another is monadological. This is monadological, okay, which delivers is rereading of Leibniz and adapting from Riemannian geometry. I won't have time to talk about it too, but you can ask me questions if you want. And finally, kind of a scale independent, which I find really interesting, a scale independent way of thinking about phenomena. In mathematics, we have these notions of what are called topological or algebraic invariants. A famous one would be like total curvature, right? If you integrate the Gaussian curvature over a manifold or surface, right, you get it by this famous theorem, Gauss-Bonnet theorem, you get a number which is the Euler, in terms of which is the number 2 pi times the Euler characteristic of the manifold, meaning it only depends on the number of holes in the manifold. Even though on the left-hand side, you're integrating in analytic quantity point by point by point. Okay? This is a very powerful and the prototype of what mathematicians call algebraic topological invariant. And they're very powerful. You can read a huge amount of information or knowledge about a manifold looking at its so-called invariants. And you can get to those invariants either from a local analysis, right, point by point, or you can look at some global properties, number of holes. And these are famous, right? These are what every beginning student in mathematics learns about. But one of my long-term projects said, well, how can we apply some of these kinds of fundamental notions? They're neither quantitative nor qualitative in the usual social science sense of qualitative, okay? But they're rigorous. Okay, can we apply these things? I think we can. Okay, turning attention to augmentations versus automation. In the history of technology, innovation technology, we have famous, important thinkers thinking about what is the purpose of these technologies, IT technologies, right? Digital computational technologies, to augment or to replace us. Okay, classic, right? Classics here, like Vannevar Bush's article, Engelbart's table, but most importantly for today, Norbert Wiener. All right. So I went back to read some of Wiener's works carefully, and it's worth reading. It's worth looking at. It's quite relevant today. Like in the 61 book on cybernetics, he saw presciently and put his finger on some of the fundamental problems I think we're facing today when we're starting up new programs, like the programs in data science and along with complex systems, okay, which we want to pay attention to. And here, for example, because he was being encouraged by Margaret Mead, for example, and Greg Bateson to apply his formidable mathematical talents to looking at the questions of communication in social systems at a social scale and applying those kinds of results to sociological economic problems. But he was cautious. He says here that he did not think that it would actually work out very easily because he said that you needed long runs, you needed enough data over enough time to get some data to work with statistically, and yet it doesn't make sense if the situation underneath is changing fundamentally. Like in the case of the steel industry, the introduction of a radical new technique, Bessemer steel process. So it won't help to collect data on the economics before and after that event because things have changed too much. Okay. And it's a beautiful analogy with magnifying lens. Okay, if you can't just make a larger aperture to get more light, if the glass itself, unless the glass itself is homogeneous to a very high precision. So collecting data on the long runs is, in his mind, analogous to that. Okay, otherwise it's specious and spurious to think you can do statistics where the qualities of the situation have changed. Even more powerfully, in terms of the human sciences, he was saying that he claims, he says here, he observes here, when we have a new mathematical technique, to just apply them to social phenomena would be as suspect as applying, for example, statistical mechanics for gas to when we're thinking of trying to understand, the point of view from the point of view of a molecule, right, itself. Because here's, I'll put it in bold, to whom the fluctuations, which we ignore from a larger standpoint, would be precisely the matters of greatest interest. Okay. This question is not just larger, it's any other frame standpoint. Okay. So if we build a kind of a model of life or model of user preference, et cetera, consumer preferences, and we use, let's say, whatever techniques we want to use, TensorFlow, what have you, right? But we don't try to include all the time the cultural and felt meaning of living under certain conditions of the subject, that subject, then it's a suspect method. Okay. All right. So, and he points out that in order to construct a statistical method that's adapted to the phenomena, we would need a statistician in bold here for whom the main elements of the dynamics of the situation are either explicitly known or implicitly felt. Okay. So how the hell are we going to get what is implicitly felt understanding what's going on? It's not by collecting more data. Maybe I'll just pause. In this other, in Human Use of Human Beings, one of his other famous books, he talks about how other value frames are always in play. In this case, you made a comment about robotics and automation, right? Which we've seen already. That any labor which compete, however, he said robots occupy the status of slavery. Okay, that's just the conditions under which they are, they work, they're employed. Okay, and any labor, however, which competes with slave labor must accept the economic conditions of slave labor. An amazing observation, if you think about it. He's a mathematician, but this comment here opens the door to politics, right? So it's outside the frame, so to speak, of cybernetics, of composite adaptive systems, of mathematical theories of composite adaptive systems, and yet it's an exogenous field of values that are going to come into the heart of our analysis, in this case of automation. So, AI and judgment. What I've been doing for all these years with a lot of people, a couple hundred people now, is to think about what engineers call human in the loop systems. All right. So meaning instead of leaving it only the human hands or in the machine hands, how can we construct what Simondon calls technical ensembles, technical objects as well as what he calls technical individuals, meaning people who know what they're doing and as Sandra was saying, also know why they're doing what they're doing. Okay. All right. With the composite system. And engineers are thinking this way too, actually. Right? When you build some sort of machine-assisted surgical systems or what have you. Okay, but it's not what's happening, let's say, with robot cars, with self-driving cars, right? If you think about it, the car already is a technical ensemble. It already is such a device, evolved over 100 years. Okay, with exquisite engagements with ambient infrastructures, roads, signs, laws, etc. Okay, so trying to automate that is actually tilting the balance toward a side that does not need to be tilted to, perhaps. Okay. Now, more perhaps fundamentally in terms of the ethics, when we think about decision systems, and this is a little side comment, which kind of how do you say a nod toward the new decision theater, what could be incorporated in the orbit of what we mean by decision. We might want to think carefully about decision making with kind of machine-assisted decision, okay, or technology-assisted decision making. I was thinking about this article about Judith Butler. Judith Butler wrote about Hannah Arendt's critique and analysis of Adolf Eichmann, right, one of the architects of the Holocaust, who was put on trial in Israel and hanged in 1962, I think. And Eichmann, in his defense, invoked Kant. He said that he invoked duty and obedience to authority. And he said that was what he got from Kant. And he was just following orders, okay? Arendt was outraged. And she writes here, this was outrageous on the face of it and also incomprehensible since Kant's moral philosophy is so closely bound up with man's faculty of judgment, which rules out blind obedience. I put those in bold. I say that algorithmic action, in fact, is the quintessence of blind obedience. right? So this is right at the heart of it, right? So in other words, if we are talking about law, ethics, then we're going to have to think about at some point this question of the faculty of judgment and the active application of judgment. Simondon writes very, very beautifully, as I said before, about the notion of technical ensembles in the milieu. Okay, and Gary Dirks has this example of Polynesian satyrs, as a skillful, organized ensemble that was able to sail across open ocean toward they knew not where at that point. Okay, but they were highly skilled. They had sets of different kinds of bundles of skills. They could organize themselves, and it was passed on through centuries, many, many generations. So it's kind of R&D. You think about it, it's R&D, but centuries of R&D, far in advance of what we do today, or what we call so-called high tech. So I think of these kinds of technologies as being most advanced technologies, this kind of technology. Okay. So my question to us, okay, but also with Global Futures is, can we learn how to drive these kinds of meso or macro scale systems, as such people were able, in their time, able to navigate across the open ocean? Okay. How can we do that? And now I need to do time check 11:44, so I'm going to need to pass on. Today I do not show most of the work of the Synthesis Center because we simply don't have the time. But I would point out there are some technical works that have been going on the past 20 years or so, where we do use continuous dynamical systems with this notion of, for example, in this case, of continuous evolution on simplicial complexities, where the complexities are defined by the human composer, let's say, of not the specific actions, but of the latent possible responses of the system to any action whatsoever. Okay, I can say more about that. It's a whole other talk in its own right. But these are, complex adaptive systems where the humans are definitely in the loop. Okay. So, pause for questions at this point. I have a few more slides after this.
Nothing in the chat yet.
Okay. I will pass by this one because it's a very nice theorem. But talking about economics, just this, I talk about this theorem by Nanosari as an example where a bit of measure theory and functional analysis can give us theorems about generic chaoticity or generic chaoticity of any any market economy whatsoever. Okay, it's a very very powerful theorem because it applies to any market economy with at least two commodities and at least as many agents as there are commodities. Okay, that's the technical requirement. In such an economy, if you look at the price bundle, the distribution of prices, and you can say, I can set up a flow, a vector field, right, on that sphere of prices, an arbitrary one. Okay, there will be some initial conditions that give that flow, no matter what flow you define. So it's an incredibly powerful theorem because it's any kind of economy. What it says is basically the dead hand, that is, the market will always converge, never works. Never works. Okay. So that's a very powerful thing. The actual statement is a bit more relaxed. It's up to measure zero. Okay. So in practice, never works. You have to be really cosmically lucky to get one where prices converge. Okay. So this, in a sense, motivates a little bit maybe looking more carefully at topological, what people call topological dynamical systems. Okay. Because there are many, many theorems which people learn, but we haven't seen applied so much yet. Index theorems, recurrence theorems, which we all know, like the Poincare recurrence theorem, fixed point theorems, and more sophisticated notions are notions of the orbit space, the set of lengths of closed orbits of geodesics inside a manifold under the action of some sort of flow, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot that's known, all right? A lot that's known. And most of it's not computable. Okay, this is not discrete mathematics, not computable, and probably not decidable questions either, but they're theorems, all right? So the question is, what can we do, right, with that kind of knowledge, and why? Because you see, as I said before, data is very expensive, it's highly constructed, right? Um, and it's very frail, and large data sets are going to be shown with all sorts of spurious correlations. So I think there's a call for these kinds of rigorous, non-quantitative, but also not language-based theorems, okay, to be able to draw inferences about the behavior of very complex dynamical systems, very complex adaptive systems, okay, hypercomplex systems, such as economies and language. But there's hope, okay? I passed by already the work in Synthesis Center where we're talking about human-in-the-loop systems that we want to scale up now, so to speak, to much larger systems in scale infrastructures, okay, like financial systems. Another very different direction is work by some interesting computer scientists in what's called non-standard computation, by which I do not mean quantum computing. A lot of the quantum computing that you read about is basically Turing-style computing, but in a quantum substrate. Okay, qubits, etc. Okay, bits again, right? But I refer you to Susan Stepney's work in York, and there's a whole research group and a whole international network. Also, my own student, Emilio Vasquez, PhD, with a background in both philosophy and mathematics and sound, is beginning to do some very interesting work on these questions of material computation. Okay. So I think because to give people some time, I'm going to see if I can pass by a little bit more. Sarah last time spoke about, fascinatingly, okay, the work of looking at like a new physics, all right? And I want to credit Stu Kaufman and Giuseppe Longo and Mel Monteville for what I'm going to say in the next few slides, and maybe I'll finish there. Okay, but basically, we are all agreed that we want to see if there's a new kind of physics, let's say. But Kaufman is skeptical. Okay, when I speak with him, he has a very strong challenge. He said he doesn't think there's any kind of let's say, closed form finite theory that we can write down that will be a theory of, an account of evolution of living systems. Okay, so, and I think his argument is pretty sound, actually. Okay, however, given that, I won't go through his arguments today. Okay, that's his talk, it's a different talk. Okay, and these are links to his talks and his book. Longo and Stewart and Mel Monteville have written several papers in this book by Longo and Monteville. They point out some hallmarks of what a theory of organism would have to account for, okay? Such as there is no entailing law, that there are adjacent possibles, there are no and these people know, and also that there are no isolated critical points, which is really quite fascinating. This idea that in a physical system, if you have a critical point, right? Often usually those critical points are isolated, or you can jiggle the system such that critical points become isolated. But in a living system, these critical points, which are metastable, right? These metastable critical points themselves are usually not isolated. That is, there's a dense open set. All right, there's a dense open set of metastable critical points. So no matter how you jiggle the configuration, you still wind up in metastable critical situation. Fundamental. And what I and Longo and other people would say, and probably Kaufman too, right, is that this is a hallmark of living systems. Because it is what constitutes freedom and intention. Okay, this is a very, very fundamental point, which sometime we could come back and talk about. But it's a big challenge to physics, okay? It's a very big challenge to physics and to mathematics, actually. I'm going to just pass by here. One of the big research questions for Synthesis Center has been, well, speaking of ontogenesis, right, the shaping of, development of life or materials or cultural systems, what are the motors of ontogenesis if it's not the principle of least action, if it's not that, right, which is usually what it's the go-to for physicists, right? even if it's extended versions of that, like Jeremy England at Harvard, who has a kind of extended thermodynamics, which favors structuration, or sorry, the construction or destruction of structure is my verbal gloss on his math. Okay, there are multiple different kinds. Well, not there are a handful of different accounts for how things come to be developing. Okay, in a processual way. And I was trained in math, so therefore my go-to is the principle of least action. But in the last 10 years or so, 15 years or so, I'm thinking that it's not adequate. Okay, it's not adequate. That's why I'm so interested in the work by these people on this slide, like David Morris. Okay. In terms of desiderata, what we would like to have, that in order to go forward and do some practical work as well as theoretical work, I like to keep in mind, okay, without letting go, matters of value, okay, such as that we are embodied as humans, we are sexed bodies, as Elizabeth Grosz has written very powerfully, that we are matter and energy, but we're not only that, we actually have other dimensions to our being in the world, such as sense, which is neither language nor is it causal, that we are born, this is Hannah Arendt's ethical theories, and have ethical, thinking of Spinoza rather than some legal. Okay. And this is where I will basically leave the door open to, this is the theory part, but there's also, as Manfred mentioned at the beginning of the hour, so one of the major works in this past 2 years during COVID has been working with United Nations, and now want to bring it back home to Global Futures, thinking about some practical projects, keeping that kind of negative and positive constraints in mind, building a kind of a set of clinics for infrastructures, which is a beginning toward responding to Gary Dirk's fundamental wicked problem that people with incommensurate value frameworks will reasonably disagree on what is the right thing to do, and furnishing these people, even with all the good intentions, right, furnishing them with more facts and data is unlikely to move the conversation. And that's what I'm proposing the infrastructure clinics to address, okay, which I know I'm not doing today, but this is one of my goals with the infrastructure clinics initiative. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Xin Wei. That was a fascinating talk. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Can you see them? Do you want me to read them off to you?
I can see one from Eric.
Yeah.
Algorithmic action is the quintessence of vulnerability. This is a very provocative statement. Yes, it was meant to be. Has anyone developed the ethical obligations? Or Eric, do you want to ask or frame it yourself?
It's the same type of thing where you're suggesting these negative consequences associated with the use of algorithmic actions without reflection sort of at the process. Nature recently had an article that talked about sort of a bunch of different ways to hide ethics behind using AI and other approaches in human in the loops. Many current grants right now are talking about responsible use of AI. And so you start with this provocative statement, but I'm wondering what comes next. If you believe that it is the precondition for blind obedience, how do you avoid that so that we can still responsibly use AI? We can get the matters of value that you talked about. Like what comes after that provocation?
Yes, it's basically the analogy I would use is like a knife, like a surgeon's knife or kitchen knife. It's actually quite helpful to have some sort of repeatability and reliability of the tool. Okay, but then how do I use a knife, right? So it's a question of course, the complicated question of what parts do we automate, and I think among us we will be careful. It's fine, okay. But what's interesting is I went to a conference, not conference, a workshop with Google folks. I don't want to blame Google. I don't want to lay it all on Google. It's endemic, okay? This idea, that's not fair, okay? It was the large project that was laid out was basically to put neural nets everywhere, and to automate every single step of the process, including legal system, et cetera, et cetera. That's where the alarm bells ring. That's all. It's just a matter of, where do you put in the automated part and where do you leave still in the hands of decision makers. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shumei. There's also a question from Hassan. Can you see that about the modularity principle?
Hassan, please. I'm all ears. You want to phrase that yourself?
Sure, yes. So, I think modularity, of course, is really quite significant in how we build systems. So I was just curious, why that is either true or false as opposed to being a range, because modularity really is a byproduct of abstraction, and abstraction is not binary, it's arbitrary.
That's a good word. That's a very deep question. Abstraction, I guess that's my point, is that there's a plethora. There are different ways to abstract, and that's what's really quite interesting. And building a model and divide and conquer, building submodels that are, supposedly dealing with maybe subset or subdimension of phenomena is one way. It's tried and true and incredibly powerful. Okay, but there are other ways. I mean, for example, when we talk about geometry, right? Let's say a circle or triangle or whatever, what have you, sphere. Each of these could be thought of as an abstraction. Just to say sphere is an abstraction. But if we go from a Euclidean sphere, equidistant to a center, right, to a topological sphere, homeomorphic to that current sphere, the standard sphere, et cetera, each of these is what you could think of as a way to coordinate thinking. It's a way to coordinate ways to think, mathematicians thinking, ways to think about, a bunch of thoughts, a bunch of theorems, what might be true, da 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 da. So yes, it's an abstraction, different kind of abstraction, right? And yet the third kind of abstraction is when a dancer looks at people moving around in a regular world, pedestrians, cooks and chefs and vacuum cleaner, people doing vacuum cleaning, and then this choreographer, and this happens, the dancer, the choreographer, abstracts from that some sort of artful movement, which is poetic, has a poetic relationship to those things, without classifying, without breaking it down. So there are all many different ways. I'm just saying that the modularity. So the modularity, and certainly in case of medicine, my father. I always say this. My father was very, very ill with multiple problems: liver, heart, diabetes, etc. And he was treated by teams of experts. He had good doctors, teams of experts, but the liver team did not speak to the kidney team, and he almost died as a result of medications that were contradicted by the other. Short story. Anyway, but that's just I'm telling a short story of how the modularity method can get in the way of treating the patient. Okay.
So your point is there might be conflicts in the way we modularize some system into parts?
That there are phenomena that are not factorable, first. Second is that factoring aspects of phenomena will also omit features, important features.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a choice.
So I'll jump in, and would you say that the problem you're talking about, modularity principle, is more the focus on the modules, but ignoring the interactions between the modules is the problem on this? That modules are not unconnected to each other, that they're actually connected in many ways.
I try to be efficient and think of examples, but the only examples I can think of right now is kind of like more math examples. Okay, behind all this talk is this idea of a vector space, really, right? The idea of a finite dimensional vector space, where usually where you can have orthogonal complements. With a metric, you can have orthogonal complements, right? And then you can represent any vector, so to speak, right, in terms of a complete orthonormal basis, right? That's kind of what we learn. But also, there are many mathematical spaces, general mathematical spaces that don't have that kind of structure. It's a theorem. You have to prove that something can be metrized into representing something which is in terms of a finite dimensional vector space. But it's something you have to establish. Okay. So that's what I mean. That there's even in mathematics, it's a very special, not it's a very large, but very special category of structure, and we can't assume even in mathematics that structure exists when you come up to a new species of mathematical objects, whatever, like. So it's something to be established. Let's put it that way. Now the other thing is this idea that you captured everything. It's complete, right? But as mathematicians, we're very careful to say it's a complete basis or it's not a complete basis, right? And I say that especially in the living world, you can never have a complete anything, or first thing. And the other is that because there are extra aspects of experience that are tacit, whatever we do represent is going to omit all the tacit anyway. So, that's it.
Thanks. It's past 12, but if there's anyone else has a question, we can raise it now. See if there's any other questions here. Well, everyone, thanks, Xin Wei. This is a really fascinating talk with a lot of concepts to think about here. So thank you very much. It's great. Appreciate it.
Okay. I'll share my slides with Trish. Be in touch. Bye-bye.